been discussing the imbalances in the business relationship between France and China and between the EU and Beijing. Let me introduce my panel again. Olivier Coippeau, founder of Mavelin Strategic Finance. We have Jean-François Gimelio, president of the Asia Center. We have Emmanuel Lanco, the editor of New China Review, and also joining us from Beijing this half of the debate is André Lozekrug Pietri, chairman of A Capital, which is the leading Euro-China equity fund. Good to have you with us as well. Thank you so much. Just before we go to you, André Lozekrug, I want to have a very quick look at some statistics of this trade imbalance that we've been talking about in part one between China and the European Union. So if you can see there, the top half of the graphic we see in green is the exports of the EU to China, and we can see that it's consistently low. That green bar is low, and that gives us the negative, the trade imbalance in the blue bar. But basically, focus on the green bar on the top half of the chart, and then the bottom part. You can see, though, however, that if you look at the green bar again, the EU is actually exporting services, but services therefore only a very small part of the overall trade in goods. So we're essentially doing well, I can't say well on trade and services, but certainly better on trade and services than on goods as a whole. André Lozekrug, how do you read this imbalance? You know, on the one hand, doing not too badly perhaps on services, but really not very well on goods as a whole.
Well, I think hello here from Beijing. I think it's pretty normal situation. What we're seeing right now is we have China developing very fast and having more and more local players, domestic Chinese companies, who are moving up the value chain and who are beginning to be pretty good at industry, even automotive or manufacturing goods. Service, I would say, is the last part of the curve, and that will take more time, more sophistication, more R&D to be really achieved. That is, I would say, the challenge for the European companies.
Is there a real problem, though, in bringing services to China? I mean, for European companies to bring services because of regulation and related issues? I mean, what's been your experience of the obstacles of investing in services in China?
It's true that if you look at the picture right now, look at financial services, for example, you will see that the market share of foreign banks was at 2% a couple of years ago, and it's still even lower than 2% today. So the situation has definitely not improved, and this is one of the things that probably the new administration will need to tackle, because that is creating a whole lot of problem in China itself. Then, as always in China, you should probably see the whole as a movie, as a moving story, and on the whole, the access for foreign firms has improved. The overall regulation has improved, and there are high hopes here among the foreign business community, but also among the Chinese entrepreneur, the private sector in particular, that reform, which kind of slowed down during the transition period, will continue, in particular in services, which are desperately needed by the Chinese consumers themselves.
Just one thing before we come back to our panel in the studio. Andrew, I'm interested in your perspective as someone with a French and German background of which of the European powers are doing particularly well in China. I mean, do the Germans, in your view, really have the upper hand when it comes to comparing the Germans and the French today?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially in France, why Germany is doing so well. I think obviously the German industry has been much better exposed to a China which equipped itself, because obviously the German industry structure is much more focused on equipment goods. I mean, everything you need to build up your infrastructure. But I think the time has come and the opportunity has come for everything which, for the French industry in particular, is important. Everything obviously around services, everything around agriculture, everything around healthcare. When you look, I'm here in Beijing, what is really today the sense of urgency is everything which is related to clean air, clean food, domestic consumption, brands. So I think really it's really a question of time, and I have high hopes that the French industry will and companies will catch up.
It's good that you mentioned health and agriculture, and I would add one thing: it's sustainable urban development, and this is why President Hollande's entourage includes a lot of people who are working on those issues. Is there a sense, do you think, Olivier Coippeau, that as China becomes more aspirational and more middle class, that there would really be enough of a demand for these other kinds of sectors to get over the current barriers and, you know, cultural barriers too, as well as technical ones?
Very clearly, we're coming there. The China market is maturing. As you know, the middle class is increasing, and the interest for the type of goods and services that countries like France, Italy, but also Germany, which is not only producing technical goods, this is clearly increasing, and we will see, as André mentioned it in Beijing, we will see clearly a shift in the coming years, and there are many examples that are clearly sustaining this analysis. And we mentioned environment. I think it's very clear.
It is a very important issue indeed, and I think for the strategy of Hollande, choosing China now is a way also to show to the Chinese that China is not the only partner in Asia for France. Because we should remind that before he was in India, in June he will pay a visit to Japan also, so it's a way also to show that France, like Germany, has many partners in Asia. It's a way also to make more diverse also these different partners.
The problem with the shift that you're talking about is that it might require a bit more of a convergence in European policy as a whole. If we're talking about, you know, cooperation between governments, and for that, I actually want to come back to André in Beijing. You know, when the Chinese president talks to other trade blocs, it's the Chinese president, and when the EU talks to China, who is the EU?
Yeah, you remember the famous sentence about what is the telephone number of Europe. And I was struck a few months ago, there was a China-Europe summit. After a pretty clear Chinese speech, you had 2 and even 3 representatives of Europe, and I won't name who basically delivered a speech which was, you know, a little bit the same, but also slightly different. So you can imagine the confusion that there is out of a Chinese view about, you know, what is the vision in Europe, what is the strategy in Europe. Obviously, all the countries, and I would say that is a little bit missing in this visit, is it's important to have a national strategy. We should not be naive. There are areas like, for example, railroad, where the competition is fierce among the French, the German companies, but there are a lot of areas where the complementarity, the industrial complementarity in Europe could work miracles in China, which is a continent country. Yeah. And I think we see too little of coordination of that. There's a lot of lip service, but unless both the policymakers but also the businessmen think more European, then I think we are going still to be divided and not necessarily in the best position here in China.
Emmanuel Lenko, your response?
And yet, step by step, we see that President Hollande was certainly the first to pay attention to the EU-China relationships by paying a visit to Vientiane in Laos last November. So this is important because he paid a visit also to Hu Jintao, the previous Chinese president at that time. So it is a way also to establish a long-term diplomacy and strategy with the Chinese, and in the name of Europe, maybe.
Let's come on to one other area, which, of course, perhaps didn't bring any surprises, but President Hollande was pretty tame in his comments about human rights in China, and didn't mention by name, in fact, perhaps the most celebrated dissident of the day, Liu Xiaobo, who's been in prison since 2009. But let's take a listen to what François Hollande had to say about human rights.
We need to bring our two societies closer. And that includes discussing subjects on which we may have differences or diverge. And that was the case in the discussion I had with President Xi. Because I think our principles should be ones of respect. That certainly is part of the friendship and consideration that we owe each other. But it also includes the principle of being frank. That's what we have done. And I think that dialogue is the best way of advancing the cause that France intends to serve throughout the world. I'm talking here of human rights.
Jean-François Dumélé, we shouldn't perhaps be surprised given that when David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, met the Dalai Lama, British officials were put into deep freeze, weren't they?
Right. Well, you know, the message is very clear. And I think during the preparation of the trip, it was very well stressed by the French administration that you cannot speak bluntly to someone that you meet for the first time. I think, of course, there were very strong messages that the previous president of France intended to bring to China, but maybe he did not take enough time to make France. So there is a very strong intention during this visit, and it has been very clearly stated by the French administration, that the first goal was first to make France and not open the debate before some links have been established.
You're saying that because the previous president of France was where did he go wrong on that?
I'm taking from the Chinese words. I'm not making a statement, but the Chinese, which usually like to set the rules, and it's always very difficult to set the rules instead of the Chinese ones. Well, they said that not only the Dalai Lama visit, but the fact that links had not been established. Then regarding Cameron, of course, Cameron went exactly the same way. And of course, last May, almost 1 year ago, he met the Dalai Lama, and same thing happens. Yet, I would like to state what I already said in the very beginning, which is that the UK trade with China is flourishing. There might be one reason for that. UK is not in the Eurozone, so of course the position in the exchange rate is not exactly the same. So that can explain as well.
So perhaps that shows that that France could afford to go a bit further and still not lose business interests. What do you think?
Yes, we know that there is a very little impact on political issue, an economical issue when you speak about politics and human rights with the Chinese. But as Jean-François Dimeglio was saying, in fact, for the first meeting, they couldn't speak about such an issue. And they couldn't speak either about the Uyghur. As you know, 29 Uyghur dissidents were killed the day François Hollande was coming for the first time of his life in Beijing.
And that wasn't explicitly mentioned either in the press conference.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, by the way, such an issue is quite marginal compared to the crisis in France and the fact that we need to renew such a relationship, because Nicolas Sarkozy and his presidency was certainly not an example of making a good and reasonable policy on the long term because of meeting the Dalai Lama like David Cameron last year.
Let's just in terms of the broader political issues, I want to bring in Andre in Beijing. One interesting thing that President Hollande said was that he saw that he and the Chinese effectively saw the need for a multipolar world, and that was seen by some as a sort of snub to Washington. But From where you are, do you think Beijing sees France as part of, as a real partner, as an essential partner in a multipolar world?
This is a very tricky question, but I will come back to my point about Europe. I think the right size for Beijing is Europe. It's the United States. You can even say it's North America. It's now more and more the ASEAN as another pole, and is the link between different South American states. So again, currently, I think the Euro crisis and the political crisis that it has as a consequence is really something extremely disturbing for China, which needs stability, which has recognized that Europe is by far, I mean, 30% of Chinese exports go to Europe, 17 go to the US. So it's almost double as important. And that's why China is basically today one of the biggest supporter of a more strong and more stable Eurozone. And obviously there are also some geopolitical interests, is to counterbalance basically the only power with whom currently Beijing can have a face-to-face dialogue.
So if they want a stronger Eurozone, it's really in their interests to improve access to the Chinese market in all these key sectors.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, so to have a stronger Eurozone, it's obviously in Beijing's interests to improve access for European companies in these new sectors that we've been talking about: health, the environment, sustainable development, and so forth.
I think what we have seen, I mean, we are managing an investment fund, and we see more and more, because of multiple reasons, Chinese companies who are more and more looking outside of China to grow. Because competition is getting strong in China. You've heard that GDP is still very strong, but it's slowing down. So it is now more and more good business to look outside, to go up the value chain, to have more technological differentiation. And all this in a context of a Chinese country which is far from being the low-cost country that it used to be.
Okay,
so this is probably the very good news for the Europeans.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have to end it there, and thank you so much to all my guests, Olivier Coippeau, Jean-François Di Meglio, Emmanuel Lanco, and in Beijing, André Loza-Krug-Pietri. And that's all for this edition of The Debate. Thank you very much for following.